It's Game 1 of the 2017 Western Conference Finals at Oracle Arena, and the San Antonio Spurs are absolutely dominating the Golden State Warriors. They're up by 21 points early in the third quarter against a historically great Warriors team that had just added Kevin Durant in the off-season. At one point, the Spurs led by as many as 25 points, a deficit no team had ever come back from in the history of the conference finals. If there's any team that could take down an overpowered opponent with multiple All-Stars, it's the San Antonio Spurs. Every single silver and gray fan knows this exact sequence by heart. Try as they may to look away, they never do, and it still hurts the same. Kawhi gets the ball from LaMarcus Aldridge on the left wing, squares up against KD, and makes his move towards the baseline. He stops on a dime and pulls up for one of his signature mid-range jumpers. But Zaza Pachulia, and I'm going to say this as objectively as possible, Zaza Pachulia gets his feet tangled under Kawhi and injures his ankle, preventing the Spurs' best player from playing another minute in the series. The Spurs would end up losing the lead, the game, the series, and eventually Kawhi Leonard. Following that series, Leonard would play in just 9 more games for the Spurs, with mysterious injuries and lingering animosity fueling his eventual departure from the franchise. And just like that, San Antonio's decades-long air of invincibility was gone. Hey guys, it's Colin, back with another team analysis video. This is the one you guys seem to really like. I hope you guys leave that like, do leave a comment, and subscribe because we're grinding to 10k subs. In this video, I'll be talking about what's wrong with the San Antonio Spurs and what they must do to get back to being the contenders that we all know they've been for so long. Ever since their untimely split from Kawhi Leonard, the Spurs have gone from perennial powerhouse to slightly above average at best. And we all know that's not a very good place to be for any NBA franchise. The best way to understand how the Spurs can get back to their former glory would be to remember how they achieved their success in the first place. The San Antonio Spurs have long been considered the model franchise amongst NBA circles. They've won 5 NBA championships spread across each of the last 3 decades, the only team to win at least one title throughout that span. It started in 1999 when they won the chip with a young Tim Duncan. Then they followed it up in 2003 when they beat the New Jersey Nets in 6 games. 2 years later, they bested the Detroit Pistons, and 2 years after that, they taught the young LeBron James a little bit of a lesson when they swept the Cavaliers for their 4th title. They then spent the next few seasons after that being counted out virtually every year. But somehow, some way, those Spurs kept coming. They were still a 50-win team that was a tough out in the postseason despite always hearing things like, Tim Duncan's too old, or the Spurs are boring. Guys, if winning 50 games every year is boring, then I hope my Wizards bore me to death next year, because we haven't even touched 50 wins since 1979. But something happened to those Spurs in the early 2010s. People started realizing that the brand of basketball the Spurs were playing, it wasn't boring. It was actually really beautiful. The Spurs predicated their offense on dynamic ball movement, making sure that everyone was always in motion and nobody held the ball for too long. This created some sequences that just made you marvel at the basketball mind of longtime head coach and arguably the greatest coach of all time, Greg Popovich.
Penetrate hard, good passes, shoot with confidence. I want some nasty.
Now let's look at the numbers. For 7 seasons from 2010 to 2017, San Antonio had consistently been at least in the top 8 of the league in assists per game. They were also first in the league for back-to-back seasons in 2012-13 and 2013-14, and it's not really a coincidence, I think, that those were the teams that made the finals. It's clear that the Spurs played an unselfish style of basketball, and that's where they found success on the court. But ever since the dreaded Zaza incident in 2017, their passing has cratered. They fell to 15th in assists during the 17-18 season when Kawhi barely played, then 16th the following year. In their 63 games so far this season, the Spurs averaged 24.5 assists per game, which is 13th in the league. One signature trait about their passing was that it always went beyond just who got the final assist on the box score. Their swift and decisive ball movement is what usually made the assist possible in the first place. They were the absolute best at the secondary assist, a term commonly used in hockey to refer to the pass leading to the assist. The secondary assist started being tracked by the NBA during the Spurs championship season in 2014. During that year, they led the league in secondary assists with 4.2 per game. Then they did it again the following year when they won 67 games with still 4.2 assists a night. They placed second, fifth, then second in the years that followed. But in the last 2 seasons, the clear-cut best passing team of the decade fell to just 11th, then 15th in secondary assists. The San Antonio Spurs shifted away from what made them successful in the first place. But that might be less about their desire to play a different brand of basketball and more about just not having the right personnel for the job. The San Antonio Spurs franchise famously drafted 3 all-time greats in Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Tim Duncan. Their triumvirate could probably make a great argument as one of the best passing trios in the history of the league. They developed an amazing chemistry over the years, which allowed them to pick and predict each other's spots on the court at all times. Nearly 15 years of playing together will definitely do that for you. But as their legendary trio eventually went from playing in big games to practicing their golf game, the Spurs needed to find new players to steer the ship. They thought they had that in Kawhi Leonard, but instead are now left with DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge. With all due respect to DeRozan and Aldridge as players, they're not exactly on the same level as the Spurs of yesteryear. DeRozan has actually been trying to get with the program though, as he's averaged 6.2 and 5.6 assists per game in his last 2 seasons playing for the Spurs. And both marks are higher than any of his 9 seasons as the frontman of the Toronto Raptors. But despite having a high assist count, it's DeRozan's strengths that hinder him and the Spurs from playing the basketball that everyone fell in love with. DeRozan has always been known as an isolation type player. He's a California kid who grew up idolizing Kobe and in turn developed the footwork and skills necessary to be an effective one-on-one scorer. DeMar DeRozan has consistently ranked as one of the most frequent scorers that use isolation. Among players who played at least 50 games, DeRozan isolated the 11th most times during the 15-16 season. The year after, he was 12th, and the year after that, he was 23rd. Even though he was already one of the most frequent isolators in the league during his years in Toronto, what's surprising is that he actually had the highest isolation frequency of his career during his first year in San Antonio. Last year, he ranked 4th in the league with an 18.7% ISO rate, and he didn't fall much further this year when he ranked 16th. With the ISO-heavy DeRozan as their best player, the San Antonio Spurs as a team followed suit. They were one of the least ISO-dependent offenses in the league from 2015 to 2018, ranking in the bottom 4 for those 3 seasons. Suddenly, with the arrival of DeRozan, they shot up to 14th and 18th in the last 2 years just by virtue of one major addition. And yeah, I know Rudy Gay is also on the team, so that also makes a difference, but he was at least there the year before DeRozan came on. What DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge have in common is their penchant for scoring in the league's dead zone, the mid-range. The Spurs have trended towards the mid-range ever since Aldridge set foot in San Antonio back in 2015. Before Aldridge, they were never higher than 18th in most field goals attempted from that zone since 2010. But in the first 3 years since adding LMA, they skyrocketed to the top 3 in mid-range attempts. With the addition of DeRozan, the last 2 seasons, they've had the highest volume in the league by a crazy margin. The difference between their league-leading 22.2 attempts this year and the second place Indiana Pacers is 4.6. That's a bigger gap than the one between their 2 Texas neighbors, the 30th place Rockets and the 20th place Mavericks. Now, despite all those numbers, what people need to understand about the San Antonio Spurs is that they didn't make these changes because they've suddenly forgotten how to play winning basketball. They only adjusted because what they've always done best all along was to maximize their players' strengths. DeMar DeRozan went from one of the best isolation scorers throughout his career to nearly the absolute best in the NBA with the Spurs. This season, he ranked 2nd in points per ISO possession, but he's just 0.01 away from tying James Harden for league number 1. And what I'm trying to show here is that the Spurs aren't suddenly being coached badly. On the contrary, Pop is doing everything he can to make sure the team still produces at a decent level. The real problem is that they're just not built the way they should be, with all their star players having strengths considered archaic in today's modern NBA. This is a symptom of a much larger issue for the San Antonio Spurs. The Spurs have long been one of the best evaluators of talent in the NBA. They've had to do this because they've consistently drafted among the lower picks every single year.
We pick people that I've never heard of. Yeah, sitting there, Emmanuel Ginobili.
Throughout the entire duration of Tim Duncan's lengthy career, they never picked higher than 20th. And in the times that I'd follow any NBA draft, when I hear about the Spurs being interested in a certain prospect, I knew it was a good sign. I think if he's good enough for San Antonio, he's good enough for my team, right? The thing is, their reputation may precede them in terms of scouting for talent, but it hasn't exactly been accurate as of late. Aside from stealing Kawhi at 15 from the Indiana Pacers in exchange for George Hill, they haven't truly found anyone groundbreaking to lift the franchise during the post-Duncan era. Since 2011, their first-round picks have produced 2 players that never played in the NBA, a couple of solid veterans in Corey Joseph and Kyle Anderson, who are good but aren't really game changers and already play for different teams. The jury's still out on a couple of them, especially guys like Lonnie Walker IV, who has shown flashes in small doses. Now, the Spurs' highest hopes were pinned on 2 guards that they drafted in back-to-back seasons, DeJounte Murray and Derek White. Murray didn't play much at first as a 20-year-old rookie, but he sure looked the part of a future piece. What's encouraging about him is that he's 6'5" and has a lengthy 6'10" wingspan, making him a tantalizing physical specimen at the 1. This meant he had the tools to be a great finisher on offense, but more importantly, a dynamic defensive weapon to deploy alongside their other potential franchise piece at the time, Kawhi Leonard. He finally got his opportunity to play in his sophomore season, posting solid averages for a guard. His expected breakout campaign the following year, though, got derailed by a torn ACL, and he hasn't exactly taken off since. Now, that's not to say that he still doesn't have a chance to be a good player, but there are still definitely red flags considering he's coming off an injury and hasn't shown the big signs as of yet. On the other hand, there's Derek White, who seems like more of the prototypical San Antonio Spurs draft pick. He had an inspiring path to the league and was a big story during their first round series matchup against the Denver Nuggets last year. He had 3 solid games to start the series and had a magnificent 36-point performance in a Game 3 Spurs win. And while White looked like he was an emerging playoff player, he got locked down for the rest of the series, especially during Game 7 when he put up a 4-point dud and shot 0 for 7 from the field. White still had high expectations for him coming into this season, especially after he was included by Popovich on the 2019 Team USA roster, which Spurs fans hope could lead to a strong 3rd year. But White has largely underachieved, posting virtually the same stats as the previous year with worse field goal percentage. Like Murray, White could still be a good player, and a good player for the Spurs, but it just doesn't feel like they have the same awe that guys like Duncan or even Parker and Ginobili had. Simply put, the San Antonio Spurs have lost their magic touch. They're no longer finding the Parkers and Ginobilis of the world, and until they learn to accept that, they may find it hard to move forward. One of the things I remember people saying as a random stat when this whole suspension thing first started was that the Spurs would keep their playoff streak alive. San Antonio hasn't missed the playoffs in 22 seasons. And while those 2 decades of dominance were certainly amazing, the Spurs needed to accept the fact that those years were immediately over the moment Kawhi Leonard demanded a trade. But instead of trading Kawhi for pieces that could have helped bridge a new era for Spurs basketball, they're still doing their best to preserve the old one. They traded Kawhi for a package that could still help them win basketball games now. While part of that is definitely to keep the last remnant of that era in Greg Popovich happy, they're not going to find success until they decide to just blow it all up. Instead of being content with middle-of-the-pack finishes, the San Antonio Spurs need to start a true rebuild if they ever want to reach the same heights as they did during the Duncan era. The Spurs might have already lost their chance to trade DeMar DeRozan. He has a player option for next season during a relatively weak free agent market. He he may very well head for greener pastures, and although the cap might be down next year due to the shortened season, a team in desperate need of a name value star just might be willing to pay for his services. Aldridge is 34 and still has 1 year remaining on his contract. He may not fetch a hefty return next season, but sending him to a team for minor assets could open up more playing time for their young pieces. A rebuilding year would enable them to test which of their prospects is worth developing for the future and also identify key holes that they need to fill in future drafts. San Antonio needs to remember that despite the fact that they've drafted all-time gems in Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili and made tremendous signings in Bowen, Ori, Danny Green, and Patty Mills that helped them win all those championships over the years, it all started with that one bad year in 1997. After their 20-win season, they won the lottery, which allowed them to select Tim Duncan, and the rest was history. Though it may be next to impossible to find another franchise player like Tim Duncan, the Spurs will still be better off giving it a shot. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. As you can see in this brand new end screen created by my boy Ramon, we are a whole crew that works to make these videos as high quality as possible for you guys. In fact, this video was written by my cousin Renzo, and he also wrote the Oklahoma City video, which will be on your screen right now. But of course, I also write a lot of the content on this channel, so if you want to see content that I wrote, there will be a playlist below that OKC video. So show some love, not just for me, but also for the rest of the team, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.